February was the popular revolution. The revolution starts in the worker zones of the city, the workers' areas, with bread strikes, bread queues and bread strikes and protests on International Women's Day. And it very rapidly spreads to the factories. Within a couple of days, 200,000 workers are on strike in the city. And this was a city which was the epicenter of the defense industry. 2/3 of the defense industry is in Petrograd. It's also characterized by enormous factories. One of the great big defense factory, the Butila factory, has 30,000 men in it, men and women, but principally. And so here you have, if you like, great strikes, protests, very rapidly engulfing the capital, which is, of course, the nerve center of power in the empire. So we have workers on strikes, and actually within a couple of days, the middle classes join in the strikes and add to the demands for bread, an end to war, and down with monarchy. So end of war, down with monarchy. Another couple of days, the soldiers are mutinying. The Tsar's instincts are simply to use the troops to suppress the disorders. But in point of fact, almost immediately they lose control of the capital, and the generals and the elites don't allow him use the troops. And in fact, he probably wouldn't have been able to use them successfully. It's within a matter of days, the streets are taken over by demonstrating, protesting soldiers, middle classes, students, factory workers. In actual fact, it takes about 4 days before any of the parties, including the revolutionary groups, offer any leadership to these political protests. And when they do, they form the Duma, the parliament, the conservative elites in the parliament form what becomes a provisional government, and then you have the focus of the popular revolution becomes a revived Petrograd Soviet. So there you have it. They persuade the generals that the Tsar has to go, the Tsar abdicates, and none of the other members of the royal family are ready to take over. And with that, in a matter of days, Russia becomes a republic. Now, when the Tsar falls, there's universal euphoria, happy demonstrations, the prisons are opened, the police force is disbanded by the new provisional government. The left-wing socialist parties in the Soviet are ready to support the provisional government. And the provisional government, it's assumed by the generals, will take over. This will satisfy the street demonstrations, calm will be restored, order will be restored, and the war will now be pursued successfully. And that is what the provisional government promises to deliver. Right? It announces civic liberties, it frees prisoners, it abolishes the Tsarist police force. And I think to those of us looking back on this period, it's a kind of Baghdad moment. Reminds me at least of the Iraq War, when the Americans go in and do away with Saddam's hated bureaucracy, police force, etc. What this actually meant for the provisional government was they deprived themselves of the tools of law and order. They lose control of the army almost at once as well, as the army is allowed by the Petrograd Soviet form soldiers' councils, which means that the army high command's orders are subject to the agreement of the soldiers who fight. So you have a rather powerless, fundamentally, provisional government, whose writ doesn't really run, not merely in the streets of the capital, but of course beyond in the wider country. Second issue is the popular revolution, which is focused on the famous Petrograd Soviet, which has nearly 2,000 delegates in it. At least almost immediately has that number of delegates in it. This is where the workers who are active in the factories and factory committees, and where the soldiers from the front, really, from the workers, or the soldiers' councils, this is where they come with their demands. The Soviet is actually guided by the socialists fundamentally, the socialist parties, but not, in fact, by Lenin's Bolsheviks. They're an atypical minority. In the Soviets, the leadership is provided by parties, moderate Marxists, the so-called Mensheviks, and by the most popular socialist party in Russia. That's the agrarian socialists, if you like, the socialist revolutionaries. And they believe in pursuing the war. They support the provisional government, which is committed to pursuing the war. And the provisional government's great mistake is to pursue the war, because they then confront exactly the same problems that that Tsarist authorities did, and they don't have the means really to pursue it successfully. It puts the country and the capitals under the same strains in regard to provisioning, in regard to fighting the war effectively as the Tsar had. In fact, those difficulties become more acute over time. So essentially the provisional government is made up of men of rather liberal constitution, middle and upper class gentry, liberals, some conservatives indeed, and they look west. They want to fight alongside the Allies, alongside Britain and France, and they think they have a kind of parliamentary democracy like them. However, they don't actually have a functioning parliament. They postpone elections. They call themselves the provisional government. And in a sense, they admit with that their own lack of permanency and their own illegitimacy. So essentially, very soon, the workers and soldiers discover that the problems that had brought them out on the streets in the first place in February remain in place, and in fact are exacerbated as the year goes on. Between July and October 1917, prices for bread, for example, go up by approximately a factor of 4, multiplied by a factor of 4. So bread becomes acute, shortages of bread. The same applies to fuel, trying to keep warm or keep things running. In the factories, there's chaos too, because the workers have demanded and got kind of workers' committees in the factories, and they challenge the power of the factory management, and in fact, fundamentally challenge the owners. The result of that is initially more strikes and disorders, and then come the summer, owners are more inclined just to give up. They decide, oh, well, we close down. So by the end of the autumn, really, certainly by October, approximately 500,000 workers have been laid off. What are those workers going to do? What are they? They're a revolutionary rabble, of course, ready to take to the streets. More fundamentally, really, some of them are being armed by the end of the summer because the provisional government's power is ebbing away all the time. The provisional government remains committed to the war effort and in fact in June launches another offensive on the southeastern front, and that is disastrous. It becomes a rout with losses of about 200,000 men. From that moment on, really, the provisional government is really living on borrowed time. Within a month, it's challenged from the right by right-wing generals who want to take over and really have a right-wing coup. That is defeated, in point of fact, by striking railroad workers. The workers in the cities are armed by the garrison. The sailors, the garrison soldiers, they're all ready to take up arms to defend the revolution. So we have a popular revolution, and only one force offers that any leadership, and that is Lenin's Bolsheviks.